Panel number 3, last not least. The first of our panels worked through some of the experiences, gave us an impression of the experiences of teaching Elie Wiesel's night in the classroom, and also having been in Elie Wiesel's classroom, as some of the panelists now also have experienced. The second panel we titled In Faith, Learning from Elie Wiesel in Faith, Jewish and Christian Theology After the Holocaust. And our third panel is a very broad theme called In Practice, Elie Wiesel's personal impact. And the question I posed to our panelists was what they learned from having studied with or from Elie Wiesel for their own professional practice. And you will see in a moment that these are distinguished individuals who have had a life of engagement, activism, professional engagements of all sorts in very complex situations. And it will be very curious for me to hear what you will have to report. By the way, these beautiful posters that were made for this event, there are some left over, so if you want to take some home with you, just plunder the desk that's out there. And while you're at it, Alan Rosen reminded us that Elie Wiesel didn't just write one book, but many books, and so we made a little memento for you to take back with you, a bookmark that on the front has our contact information, so you can find us again, and on the back has a list of books by Elie Wiesel that I personally sat down with my computer one night and a bottle of wine and and went from WorldCat to verify each and every letter that's written on here. This is all trustworthy information, so the wine didn't interfere, I think. Last but not least, if you're interested in the work of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, we have a little trifold for you that we update on a regular basis. This is from fall 2017. And if anyone here wants to major in Jewish studies or minor in Jewish studies, we have that information as well.
For some of us, it's a little bit too late.
So we decided that we'll start on the right, stage left, audience right, with Janet McCord, a former student of Elie Wiesel's and a thanatologist, or is it a thanatologist? Thanatologist with a TH. It's difficult for me as a German to say TH properly. And she will tell us what she learned for her practice.
And you said we have an hour. Just kidding, I get it. How does one encapsulate everything one's learned from Elie Wiesel in 5 minutes or less? I have to go back to 1979, January of 1979, when Martha kindly made it possible for me to be part of the class, even though I was at another institution getting my master's degree. During that time, 79 to 81, one of the best courses he taught was his own works. I graduated in 81, full of conviction about how it's important to not stand idly by when others suffer, which is one of the most important lessons that he taught me. I got married. We joined the Peace Corps and spent the next 2 years in what was then Zaire, what's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, teaching people how to dig fish ponds and grow tilapia. It fed people in an area where people didn't get much to eat. We came back, and I had been invited to come back when I was ready to do my PhD. In 81, he said, "Come back, you'll have a place with me." And it wasn't right at that point. We were living in New Hampshire, but in 1986, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And I said to my husband, "Look, you know, I know people with PhDs in literature and religion are a dime a dozen. It will not get me a job. I get that, but I have to go back." And in 1987 in fall, I started. And I had my first meeting with him, and I went into his office, as we were able to do, and he said, I have a project that I want you to do for your dissertation if you're interested. Now, I hadn't started classes yet. I said, oh, what's that? He said, well, I want you to do your dissertation on Holocaust survivors who became writers after the war and then died by suicide. I said, oh. So tell you what, let me read everything I can get my hands on, and then I'll let you know in December what I think. So I started doing that, reading everything I could get my hands on, which in 1987 wasn't a lot. But I read everything and came upon the work of Edwin Schneidman, who in the 1950s spearheaded the first ever suicide prevention center in the US, the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center. He became a national force in expanding centers like that across the United States and so on. And I read his work. In particular, he was the one that made the most sense to me. So I continued my work, and at the end of the day, I wrote my dissertation. Schneidman became another mentor to me. I've been doubly blessed. And essentially, that shifted my entire path. I had no idea I was going to become a suicidologist, especially one that's neither a clinician nor a quantitative researcher. And the bulk of people in suicidology are that. But Joe, you said something in your remarks about that he had stood on the edge of the precipice. And every suicidal person stands on the edge of the precipice. And it's our job, anybody's job, it takes a village to prevent a suicide, to try to bring them back from that edge so that maybe they can find the strength and the will to live. There was something else I wanted to add, and it's gone clean out of my head. So let's leave it at that. We'll get back to it maybe.
I can ask you a question.
You can.
And that is, when you consider Elie's life story and his presence in the classroom, what would you say was encouraged you to take on such a difficult assignment? What was it that you saw in Wiesel?
Okay. Suicide prevention is a social justice issue. It's absolutely one of the most important social justice issues that we have. And in fact, I'm working with Michael Kroll, who teaches at Wayne State University. We're developing a chapter on suicide prevention and the non-professional mental health worker movement, which Schneidman started and has continued to this day, to not only prevent suicide, but also to support people who are bereaved because of suicide. And I wanted to share one more story. And that is, I came across an interview that he had done with Harry James Kargas back in the 1970s. It was published, in which they talked about the suicides of Holocaust survivors. And he said to Harry James, he said, one day, Harry, one of your students or one of mine will have to do their dissertation on this topic. And so I had the opportunity to ask him, I said, okay, why me? I said, you've had, this is 1990, by the time I'd read that, you've had probably dozens of people come to you and say, I want to do that topic, because they read that interview, right? He says, I was waiting for you. Why? He says, because I knew you could study this topic and not be tempted.
Oh, I see.
I do psychological autopsy investigations. I'm a certified psychological autopsy investigator, and that's a qualitative research post-mortem review. And you start at ground zero, which is the person closest to the person who's dead. And you find out, you rebuild that person's life story, going up to the weeks or the hours before that person's death. And then you go out in concentric circles, and you interview the constellation of people that were around that person to try to have some better understanding. And it was Schneidman who created that whole process of psychological autopsy. We live in a traumatized world, and the stigma associated with being suicidal, with surviving suicide as a bereaved person, of surviving a suicide attempt, and the stigma of our mental health, people that have mental health challenges face a tremendous amount of stigma. And it's important for us to recognize that these are people in pain, and to remember that there are just two questions one needs to ask. And one is, where do you hurt? And how can I help you? And in so many ways, Professor Wiesel asked those questions. So when I heard those questions iterated by Schneidman, they were really comfortable questions.
Thank you. Let me introduce you to Sonari Glinton, who I know as my student many, many years ago, and who has gone on to become a very successful journalist. I would say very successful, because I hear your voice all the time, and every time I hear your voice on NPR talking about cars and things of that sort, I say, that's my student.
Yeah, well, when I just realized when I came, pardon me for being overly romantic or something, but I started at Boston University 25 years ago. So to be coming back is like, it's a weird thing, and I've worked here before, but this was very weird. I was talking to my mother earlier, and she said, behind every great man, there are several women who are probably not getting enough credit. So I went to say to Martha Hauptman and Marian Wiesel, who I feel like I got much of my work via his wife, right? And me and my friends were talking about this at work, that there's so many writers whose wives either translate or research, and it's like, well, I don't read Yiddish or French, right? And the way that I got a lot of Professor Wiesel's work was via his wife, and the way I got a lot of his teaching was via Martha, who created an atmosphere that was really special, I think, in the classroom, and I greatly appreciate that in you. But I always think of to go from, I think of the humor and the thought. I remember once we were in a group, Professor Wiesel was not there, and someone used the phrase shanda, which I, now forgive this Roman Catholic for, which is meant, that is the way that I think of it as a lightning rod for like all of the, a lightning rod that sort of points out the stereotypes, right? That, and we were talking on this, and I think that the thing professionally that Professor Wiesel gave me was the ability to not to be afraid to be the shanda, right? To not to be afraid to be the quote shrill woman, to be the angry black man, to be the annoying Jew, to whatever it is. It's like, this is my, like, if the thing that I wrote yesterday was, what's the use of having a seat at the table if you keep your mouth closed? And so for much of the time that I was a reporter beginning at NPR, for a while I was the only black male reporter at NPR, right? And I've often been, and this is one of those things, I've often been the only, only black person in the room, one of the few black people in the room, and there's this, I remember when I was at BU, it was sort of a tumultuous time, Million Man March. I remember we had, there was an imam from the Nation of Islam who came to BU, and Professor Wiesel was a part of the teach-in there, and I remember, I grew up in Chicago, and literally I was born at 1118 East 54th Street, which is next door to Mosque number 2 for Elijah Muhammad, and I grew up in Hyde Park in Chicago, so this was a part of, it was always that, it was a part of the conversation. And I think what it is having to be in the room and say the thing, right? I am never going to get a Nobel Prize, right? Like, no one is ever going to point out, like, no one gives you a cookie when you stand up to power. And it's not, I mean, we think standing up to power means standing up to power, but that never is how it is, right? And the example I always use is kind of funny, is I was a production assistant at All Things Considered. And it was during the it was during the McCain-Obama campaign. And someone throws out a pitch for a story. It's like, look at all the strange names of these kids who are the children of these candidates, right? Sasha, Malia, McCain's children had funny names, Biden's children, right? I can say that, my name is Sonari, I have a funny name. And so I'm sitting there, and it's in the morning, and All Things Considered, it starts in the morning at 9:30, you have to be there, and this story is about to get on, and I'm watching it. It's leaving the gate. Like, this story about these kids, like the idea that we were going to do a story on All Things Considered about the names of these kids, and I sit there, and they're booking it, right? It's going to be a thing. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, what? Like, really? And those are the moments I feel like when it counts, it's the small times, right? It is when people are gonna make fun of you. It's when you have to you have to be like, do I have to be the black guy again? And like, and I remember I think it was because of one of the success stories, because often, you pick up the phone, you call and you say, I don't like this, or, you hear something and like, maybe it shouldn't be done that way. But I have to say, as a charter member of the Funny Name Club, I don't think that we can do this story, because, and I realize that as a charter member of the Funny Name Club, right, this takes out the humor, like, relieves the tension, and that idea died on the vine in a second, right? But it was really scary. And it's always scary, because you're looking at, on the other side of the table, are journalists who've been there for 25 years, and they know what this is about. And you realize that there are all of these moments that you have in your life, and they are very small. It is the woman who's talking, and everyone shoots the idea down, right? And you need to be the person who, like sometimes, do I have to do this again? Yes, you have to do this again. And because I think some people have, and we were saying this as I was talking to a friend of mine, Sarah Saracen, who was an editor at NPR. We joke, she's a Japanese Jewish lesbian. And
now also out.
Yeah. Oh, no, she's more than out. And we were like, yes, you do. This is what bearing witness is. It is when you're uncomfortable. That is it. That is all. It is being uncomfortable, not being afraid of being a Shonda. And it's funny is that in a way, that is the way in which my world, that makes me a better journalist, right? Why is that? Not being, just the ability to laugh at ridiculousness, and to know that, one of the things I've been complaining about is I'm a car reporter, and I live in West Hollywood. And you have to, is not only, if Elie Wiesel had to remind people, and his presence annoyed people because it reminded them, Christians, I'm a Catholic, of what Christianity did. I am a symbol of, like, what America does, right? I'm the car reporter in West Hollywood. So I drive random cars, and I have to, that are not always mine, and I've been stopped 11, 12 times over the, no, it's a thing, and my bosses do not get it. I have to, I mean, like, really, you have to be like, you know, and it's never comfortable, because you don't want to be that guy, because that is because you're afraid if well, I don't want to be the, I don't want to be the angry black guy. I don't want to be that guy. But then that is the power of, I think, what Knight tells us and what his work says, is that many of us are not going to be in the situations to talk to Gorbachev or to talk to Ronald Reagan or to do those things. But I really believe that in a newsroom, in your office, in a barbershop, I'm a gay man, and I go in a barbershop, right? Nobody knows I'm gay, and so when you hear something, do you say, hey? It is amazing how much good that does. When you just say it, and it doesn't have to be like, and I remember, the thing that I remember the most from Professor Wiesel was sitting around talking, and it was a very different place at the time, and this was my conclusion, and he said essentially that the people who say that you should forget are not your friends. And I think about that when your boss tells you, be the bigger man, be all those things. I don't have to be. Those people are not my friends. And I think that we have a responsibility, the people who knew him, who are in his class, and as my friend Sarah and I say, you know, us Gen Xers, like, these people were our bubbies and our zadies. We knew them. It is our responsibility. I realized when Professor Wiesel talked about forgetting, he was talking to me. It is literally my responsibility. I was in the classroom with him. If I'm that person, what am I? I mean, this is, and I feel very strongly about the Gen X thing, is these are our people. We knew them. I grew up in Hyde Park. I knew so many survivors, right? I'm a son of a 75-year-old black woman. Like, I have to represent. And that is the power of, that's how it affected me professionally and personally.
Thank you, Sonari. I can see that Martha Hauptmann taught you well. Our next panelist is Cornell Brooks, who headed the NAACP for a long time and who is this year a professor here at the School of Theology and the School of Law at Boston University. And I'm delighted to have you here.
Delighted to be here. So when I arrived at Boston University from an HBCU, Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, I did not come here as a theological or philosophical sophisticate. I came from a rather conservative background and had not heard of Elie Wiesel at all. And one of my classmates, astounded at my ignorance, said to me, well, you've got to get into his class. Well, it helps to first know the professor's name, particularly at that time you had to petition to get into the class. And somehow, miracle of miracles, I got into the class. And as a young seminarian, I took a class called The Literature of Rebellion. And I came to Boston University to study with Walter Mulder, who admitted and taught Dr. King. I was fairly familiar with the prophetic tradition and prophetic literature, but taking a class called The Literature of Rebellion, where we talked about Job, we talked about Camus, we talked about Shakespeare, Hasidic folktales, and we explored these various pieces of literature as validating rebellion against injustice, rebellion and argument and contention with God, and for a rather conservative member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church from a college in Mississippi via Georgetown, South Carolina. This was a profoundly mind-blowing experience. And it was a class in which literally, as a young man, I felt like I was in the presence of moral greatness. For example, every student in the class had the opportunity to have tea with the professor. And so on the occasion that I was to have tea with the professor, I arrive, the secretary tells me something has come up. The tea will have to be postponed. So I arrive in class the same day. There were reporters everywhere, in the windows, down the aisles. I asked one of my classmates, what's going on? And my classmate says the professor's won yet another award, the Nobel something or another. So again, this was a mind-blowing experience for me. But I came out of the class profoundly affected in a number of ways. One of which was I came out of the class understanding that to bear witness was the responsibility of not only Nobel laureates, but also soon-to-be ministers, soon-to-be civil rights lawyers. And bearing witness is not merely a matter of reflecting on the long ago past, but reflecting on current injustices and lifting up your voice and speaking out in prophetic ways. I also learned to connect history to what was happening in the New York Times, or what was being reported in the New York Times. And so as we find ourselves amidst this Twitter age civil rights movement, engaging a new generation of millennial activists, it's important for us, when we talk about never forget, to contextualize what we are seeking not to forget in the context of what we are yet remembering. Critically important. The other thing that was impressed upon my spirit was this. When I entered Boston University, candidly, the Holocaust was on the periphery of my moral imagination. It was a matter of historical fact, but I never, being from South Carolina, I had not met a survivor. And so going through a class like that was a morally expansive experience. And so one practical consequence was when I became the president and CEO of the NAACP, I determined that I did not want the relationship between the African American community and the Jewish community to be a matter of nostalgia. So that we look back at the photographs of Martin Luther King and Heschel with a romanticized gaze, but instead look at our children and our grandchildren and talk about what we can do now. And so when the NAACP marched 1,002 miles from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., we had 200 Reform rabbis, 1 out of every 10 in the United States. We wanted to make this Twitter age civil rights movement about the relationship between African Americans and Jews today, being informed and inspired by what happened yesterday. That's a direct moral consequence of what I learned in that class. It also affected me profoundly in terms of the theodicy question. So studying Job as a Christian seminarian, understanding that the question of good and evil and why do bad things happen to good people, how do we reconcile suffering with a compassionate God, I came out of that class understanding the resilience of the soul, the fact that we wrestle with God, the fact that we wrestle with one another, and the fact that we yet wrestle in some ways is a testament to our broken but yet surviving faith. And so when we see police tragedies across the country, when we see voter suppression in 2017 that mirrors 1948, 1958, it doesn't mean we give up. It means that we understand that hope is not an emotional luxury, but a moral necessity. That's a direct consequence of that class. So it profoundly affected me.
Thank you. This is all the time we have for this panel. I want to thank all of you for sharing what you did.